Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com, and welcome to my podcast, and which you might be listening to under several different names on your favorite podcast catcher, on YouTube or whatever. But what I want to talk about today is different models for funding scientific research. I was listening to this Vox podcast, because they oftentimes, even if I have ideological differences with a lot of the commentators on Vox, they oftentimes, have pretty robust conversations that I find valuable. So they were having a conversation about sort of like what we learned about vaccines, but it was really more of a conversation about how to fund research. And one of the panelists was really, really driving questions that were trying to gear one of the people that we're talking to towards a particular conclusion, which is basically, well, considering what's occurred, does this make you question basically the gist of every question was, so does this make you question capitalism, and why is the answer yes? The kind of questions where it's you're leading with your conclusion, which is a thing you see on all sides. But it's generally it's an unfair way of asking questions, of telling people what they should answer. And the person that was kind of the guest they had on was pretty good at trying to just give their honest perspective, which was just basically this is how things happen and whatnot. But basically, let's kind of break it down. Looking back at everything with the mRNA vaccine created for COVID. So this was actually pretty interesting because I didn't know a lot of this stuff. But essentially, basically, the traditional way you create a vaccine, let's say you create a vaccine for polio or whatnot, what you do is you take a weakened version of the virus and you introduce it into people's. This part I knew. You get given a little bit chunks of the virus, and that then your body learns how to kills the virus and learns how to produce antibodies for that virus going forward. So that way, if stronger versions are introduced, your body's kind of prepared for it. The problem is how weak does the virus need to be, and this is kind of where the research comes in. So basically, you have to kind of come up with different versions, because you don't want the virus so weak that you don't really develop enough antibodies, but you don't want it so strong that you make the person sick. So kind of, doing all this sort of trial and error, which I think they accurately described as artisanal. So essentially, it takes longer to do the research to build the vaccine, and then when you lay on the regulatory approval process and how long that takes, it takes a long time to get a vaccine out. Now, what was really different with the COVID vaccine was that it used a different approach. So I guess this is where the word mRNA comes from, where instead of really kind of giving you a weakened version of the virus, I guess from my understanding is that they're injecting some instructions, some proteins that give instructions to your other proteins on what antibodies to generate. So in the sense that you're not necessarily going to be it's a lot more plug and play. So the idea is the benefit of this sort of way of making vaccines is that you can do it a lot quicker, because all you have to do is create the right instructions to create the right antibodies. You're not necessarily having to worry about hey, is the virus too weak or too strong, because you're not necessarily introducing the virus. You are introducing sort of this kind of way of changing how the body generates antibodies. So you are literally genetically modifying the person in a sense. And this technology has been around for a while, but it never really was used in practice. And this is kind of where the debate in the conversation went, where the debate was between sort of well, you have companies like Pfizer, and the argument was that it wasn't necessarily a huge profit center for a big company like Pfizer, because vaccines are something you take once and then you don't need to take it again. So it's not something like Pfizer's big money maker, Viagra, which you have to take over and over again and can be very profitable. So Pfizer, and so basically, again, that person was really trying to drive this. That one panelist was really trying to drive that point, oh well, if Pfizer doesn't have the profit motive, should the government get involved? And then the person they're interviewing comes back and is well, but then you have to take a look at Moderna. Moderna was this small sort of startup that's actually named after mRNA type vaccines. That was their big bet as a startup. They were betting that this new technology was going to be big someday, and COVID happened, and it kind of worked out for them. Otherwise they probably wouldn't have survived. Okay, so they bet big on. So the idea is that, like, hey, even if bigger companies make much more prudent decisions, you generally have startups who take much bigger risks, which is, what is to be expected. I don't expect big companies to take giant risks, and I expect smaller companies to take risks and succeed or fail based on those risks. Sorry for my throat's a little choppy today. But yeah, so essentially that's like the technology. So the question was like, hey, this is a really useful technology, and why hasn't it like been, if this is such a cool technology, like, why aren't we using this for like the flu shot and all this stuff? I mean, I guess part of the things I heard was this type is a little bit more expensive to put together, a little bit more expensive to manufacture. So, for example, the flu shot, there already is this pre-existing way of doing it. They already got to the groove, so there's this inertia. But again, this one panelist is really trying to blame this inertia on the profit motive. A lot of times, I mean, and you see this in the private and public sector, inertia is just inertia. If people are already doing things a certain way, it's hard to get them to change unless the added value is great. And COVID, in this sense, really did create this sort of huge value add of adopting this new technology. In the same way, like things like cryptocurrency, like it wasn't until certain situations, like when Cyprus threatened to like take money from people, that suddenly like the added value of trying this other thing out was there. It doesn't matter that it's better. It matters is it better enough that brings me enough value versus what I'm using currently. And that doesn't matter whether it's private or public sector. Like at the end of the day, people don't change their behavior unless the reasons to do so are compelling. And it's not a matter of like who is the actor, private or public. But this person on the panel, I do recommend listening to this episode because it was quite amusing, like how they kept trying to steer the conversation in this direction. So yeah, but basically that shows you sort of like one model. Like like when you take a look, big companies make more prudent decisions, and smaller companies take risks, but you get a balance of both because you have multiple actors, and that's kind of like the benefit in capitalism because you have multiple actors. Then they pointed out some other, but then the question just becomes like, what happens if a Moderna failed? Okay, so does that mean, like, hey, startups that took the right risks just at the wrong time, does that mean like the technologist just dies with it and we lose out on technology? Maybe we need the government to get involved and prioritize these things. Now, if you know anything about how like what happens when companies fail, like it's not like the technology just disappeared. Okay, like if a company fails, it generally gets acquired, absorbed by some other company that sees values in its assets. And so that patent or whatever, assets they have technologically would still be of value to somebody and would be liquidated in the process to whoever finds it valuable. Although it looks like this was like a technology that like was available to many companies because again, Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson all use this mRNA technology throughout this process. So, but then they pointed out this other model where basically you have like sort of, philanthropists. And I mean, because the issue is like they're thinking like they're talking about like how like right now they get funding. If you're a scientist, you have to like write grants, and this takes time. Okay, and although when you get funding from the government, you still have to write grants. So like I'm not seeing the difference here. Because again, the vision I think people always have in their head of like the government taking over is that the people who are going to make the decisions of who allocates money to who are these like perfectly all-knowing, benevolent people who like know exactly where the money should be prioritized. Are good judges of who to give that money to, because just because you have the right priorities doesn't mean you're giving the money to the right research. And three, that they have the right priorities, so like, and that they're incorruptible, which again, in all reality, oftentimes isn't the case. Again, it's not an issue of private or public. It's an issue that actors in any capacity are corruptible. The issue is, given corruption of an actor, are you able to find an alternative? And that's essentially like sort of like the big argument for capitalism is that not that it's incorruptible. It's very corruptible. Everything's very corruptible. The key thing is that you can find an alternative. So in the sense, like if a company like Pfizer won't do something, maybe a startup like Moderna does. If traditional foundations who ask you to write grants, you can find some wacky billionaire who just likes to give their money to like very niche research. And they were pointing out some guy who likes to give money for like space research. for researching stars, intergalactic travel. But then they made the argument that, hey, well, that's not very useful technology, so like that's not a good funding model either. Like philanthropy should be used to prioritize the things that I think are a priority. Like that's the problem. Everyone has like different priorities, and that's the issue when everyone imagines, like, they say like, hey, no, the government's all of us, but at the end of the day, people always imagine it as an extension of themselves, and imagine that, hey, if I could just force everybody to follow my priorities, things will be better. And that's kind of always the deal. Problem is, again, you have to delegate things at the end of the day, like whether private or public. It's not all in the hands of one person, and everyone has their incentives, their own individual priorities, the things that influence them, and you can't control these factors. That's why you want there to be alternatives. You want there to be as many possible routes to get something done as possible, because a lot of them will fail, and you want there to be, you want to raise the probability of success by having as many sort of possible avenues as possible. Okay, so that's kind of where like that conversation goes. So you see the model of, hey, wacky science who just cares about the idea, doesn't really, you don't need to write a lot of grants, just say, hey, you're doing the thing that that person cares about. There's the model of, hey, a big company will fund research in things that are like likely profitable, which is fair. Like that's essentially like that's their business. And at the end of the day, like, these businesses employ people, their shares fund people's retirement, so there's other social good from them focusing on their returns, so that way they can keep those people employed and keep and also make sure that there's a return in people's retirement accounts or in their investment accounts, which then they take those returns and either spend them or invest them in something else. So like, even if the company that, like, let's say Pfizer doesn't do cutting edge research, people who probably invest in Pfizer probably invest in the healthcare sector and will take the returns on Pfizer and make some bigger bets on startups like Moderna. So the returns on Pfizer the growth of Pfizer ends up trickling. I hate using that word. Let's not say trickling, because it's not really a trickle. But it does end up like reverberating or rippling into other enterprises in the same sector, because oftentimes the bigger investors are often these like fund investors who they invest in a sector and they're balancing the risk, so they may put a bulk of their money in Pfizer because it's a safer bet, but then as they make returns, that allows them to increase their allocation in smaller companies like the Modernas, and you have that. You could have government do funding, and they do, and sometimes they're successful. And that was another thing they pointed out, like where like they have, like, I guess there's these programs where they have government researchers, where the government will hire the researchers, but they seek out private funding, and if they figure the thing out, then the people who provided the private funding get a stake in owning of the intellectual property, and people weren't thrilled with that either, which I can understand that. But they just really wanted where like the funding wasn't tied to some sort of private person, but at the end of the day, it is. Even government funding is still tied to private people, because it's not like everyone's involved in every decision, and it's not like we elect people based on a very clear priority. Like when someone elects president, senator, or congressman, there's dozens of possible issues that someone could have voted for one party or the other party. So there's no clear mandate of like what that representative should do. You can do polling, but not everyone's reachable through polls. Like there's no, at the end of the day, like you're still just subject to the whims of the people you elect. Okay, you might try to elect the people whose whims you disagree with less, but it doesn't mean you're not going to still end up being subject to the whims that you disagree with. And the things that you may have elected them based on a priority you have, but the place where that actual person you elected's priority is an area you disagree with them on. So now you just, they may not do anything in regards to the part where you did care about, and do a whole lot in places you disagree with. So it's a real like mixed bag. It's not, people always can imagine sort of like, well, if we elected the right people and they all did the right thing and they all got along just fine. And again, same thing in like, and that goes not just for government, but for business, for all kind of like, you can't bank on the world being perfect, and you can't bank on things working perfectly, which is again why you want alternatives. You want to have, you want to diversify. How social progress is achieved. Okay, so I'm not necessarily making it right now. I'm not trying to make an argument that there should be like no government role. Like I definitely am. You guys all know that like I'm a libertarian and I'm generally like for a less government role. I'm not gonna get into like debates about degrees, but I'm making an argument that the government shouldn't have the sole role, or that there is a very significant role and a positive role in having many actors involved in the funding of all the things, and leaving that to sort of being the, having people with conflicting interests and, making different decisions with resources. Okay, because when you take, everyone thinks like as the healthcare industry is a bunch of companies that just work together. No, they're all competing against each other, so they all have opposing interests, and they all try to find new ideas to compete against each other, and it's a good thing. But inside the companies, they're working to cooperate with each other between the staff of the company. Like you're developing. Entrepreneurship occurs at two levels: entrepreneurship within the company to figure out how can we work together better, and then externally figuring out like how can we be better than our competition. So you're having the forces of competition and competition constantly being sort of refined. Not perfect. Not saying it's perfect. Not even close. But I mean, a lot of the criticism I find like sort of overblown in a sense. Like there's just like oftentimes it's saying, well, what if this scenario? Always it's kind of like reminds me of when I watched like the movie Repo Man. It's a movie with Jude Law and there's also another movie called Repo the Musical. I enjoyed Repo the Musical. It's actually worth watching. You can watch it on Amazon Prime. But they both kind of had a similar plot where you have this world where there's organ transplants, and basically if you can't afford the organ transplant, you can finance it, but if you can't pay back the loan, they rip out your organs. They send people to come out and repossess the organs, which is bizarre. That's not how things would work. Like you don't, like I could see like the mob doing that, but even the like at the end of the day, like you don't, like no business evolves that way. Like you have like companies like Rent-A-Center, like they'll take back the furniture, but they won't like physically kill you. And if you were to disappear with the furniture, like your credit will be ruined, but they're not going to hunt you down. Like, and then of course, like there would be like credit assessments and underwriting and a bunch of things involved that would prevent things from ever getting kind of that level. But I mean, this is sort of like what people imagine. They always imagine sort of like this worst case dystopian scenario, and it goes both ways. Like again, you talk to like libertarians like myself, a lot of times we'll imagine like this sort of like, not necessarily the government that is, but the government that could, the worst government that could be. So we're imagining like this very dystopian version of what government can be, because it's theoretically possible. In the same way, like you can theoretically imagine that world where people repossess organs. But by focusing on sort of like the dystopian, like probably not gonna happen scenarios, you kind of lose track of like where we are, and having a conversation about where we're at to actually like see if you can influence things in a better direction. Now, I'm not saying like there's like important to not have dystopia, because you kind of want to have a vision of what you're trying to avoid. Like I definitely want to avoid like a 1984 like Big Brother government, but I also want to avoid dystopian enterprises that repossess my organs. But there's no magic bullet to prevent that. The way we prevent that is by being society that engages with each other and talks to each other. But I still very, very much see like the benefits of this, like, again, free enterprise, and again, I just always oftentimes again feel the criticisms are exaggerated in the same way probably people feel like criticisms I've made in the past of government may seem exaggerated at times. Again, I can see it both ways, because again, I'm attuned to sort of people making sort of overblown criticisms to when talking about like free enterprise and markets, in the same way probably other people are sensitive to like overblown arguments when it comes to like characterizing different government practices. I do think there's a difference. I do think there's a difference of layers of consent, but that's a different discussion. That gets more into like a philosophical discussion about sort of like, but I do think that it has real world ramifications. I do think like a world of consent has an effect where you have consent, and the more consent you have or require in society, in the sense that like, hey, everything has to be done by the consent of the people, Like you can't do something. Like you can't be forced to do something you don't want to do, and you can't force someone else to do something they don't want to do. Like that level of consent kind of breeds a need for mutual respect, because again, since I can't force you to do something, I have to convince you to do something, which requires me to kind of like be someone you would listen to, which requires like, again, an element of respect. And there's a closer bonding society, because again, there's just a need for each other. Again, even then, people get wary of having to need other people, which is like, it's always weird, like, because again, you hear people like, they're making the argument that we should do things more as a society, but in the same token, they're like, we don't want society to do things because we don't trust them, which I can understand, because there's people who do bad things, people who don't, when you try to sit there and try to think of society as like this social environment, and you see how some people treat their families, some people treat their children, how some people treat their parents, and especially if you were on the receiving end of that, how you can be how that skepticism can grow in you. I get that. But at the end of the day, like, oftentimes I think those are exceptions to the rule, and in my experience, most people are all right, not perfect, but they're all right and well-intentioned, and oftentimes, even the bad things they do is oftentimes coming from a good place. Not that justifies bad actions, but the point is, like, the natural inclination of people is generally positive towards other humans. And I believe that to an extent, that I think that nature should be, we stand benefit from embracing that than trying to control that. But yeah, those are my thoughts for today. I know I haven't done a podcast episode in a while, so I figured I'd record a thing and you guys can take it as you will. So you guys have a great day and enjoy.